Chapter 1. The Passenger Who Counted the Windows. The first thing Dr. Matteo Loredan noticed was the birdcage. It stood on the forward deck of the Santa Lucia, lashed to a brass rail with a lady's blue scarf, though there was no bird inside it. Cage was small, gilt, and faintly ridiculous, with a porcelain dish fixed to one side and a tiny mirror that flashed each time the steamboat turned between the palaces. Water slapped the hull with soft, dirty hands. Above them Venice rose in worn pinks and greys, windows shuttered against the late October damp, her church bells striking 10 with the resigned patience of old servant. Alaric Voss paused the cage. He was a narrow, immaculate man of Swiss birth, gloves the colour of bone, and a dark coat, brushed to a state of moral superiority. In his left hand he held a folded programme for the evening's private cruise. In his right, half hidden between two fingers, pale blue ribbon he always carried. He had not yet tied a knot in it, which meant either that nothing had contradicted itself or that he was being polite to the morning. "A cage without a bird," said Voss. "That is almost always more interesting than a bird without a cage." "You admire empty things, monsieur?" asked Signora Elena Fabri, who had overheard him. She was a Venetian widow of 40, handsome, in the deliberate manner of women who have chosen beauty as armour. Her laugh came quickly, but never before she had measured its effect. "In Venice we call that good taste. Half our palaces are empty. Tourists pay to photograph them." "I admire arrangement," said Voss. "Emptiness is often the last arrangement left behind." The steamboat belonged to Cesare Belluno, glass merchant, collector, and tyrant of conversation. He was 68, broad, perfumed, and so conscious of his own importance that even his cigar seemed employed by him rather than smoked. He had invited 11 guests for a cruise from the Riva degli Schiavoni to Murano and back, where supper would be served in the lower saloon. Printed programme called it a celebration of Venetian enterprise. The servants called it, under their breath, another of Signor Belluno's trial. Belluno himself stood beneath the striped awning, tapping ash into a silver cup. "My friend," he declared, he looked at no one with friendship, "you are aboard the last elegant steamboat in Venice. Not a motor launch, not a vulgar tourist barge, but a vessel with a history. My father dined here with ambassadors. My mother fainted here before a prince. I have brought her back from neglect. Tonight we honour restoration." "Restoration is often the prettiest word for possession," murmured Voss. No one answered, perhaps because they had not heard him, or perhaps because the remark had landed too neatly. Among the guests was Marco Belluno, the dead man's nephew and presumed heir, though at that hour Cesare Belluno remained vigorously alive. Marco wore a cream suit, despite the season, and smiled as though smiling were a debt he intended never to repay. Beside him hovered Viola Reni, a singer whose voice had once filled Milan theatres and now trembled slightly when she spoke. She touched her throat often, not theatrically, but as a woman touches the locked door of a room she fears to enter. There was also Father Anselmo, a soft-faced priest, with red hands and eyes too young for his grey hair. He spoke in gentle unfinished sentences. Every time Belluno raised his voice, priest looked toward the canal, as though forgiveness might arrive by boat if signalled properly. Professor Dario Soranzo, historian of Byzantine trade, professional enemy of joy, complained about the angle of the deck chairs. His wife, Beatrice, corrected him in whispers that were sharper than open scolding. Captain Ruggiero Nanni stood near the wheelhouse, silent, thick-necked, sun-brown, a man who had spent his life learning that water listens better than. Lastly came Nora Belluno, Cesare's niece by marriage, 26, dressed in mourning, though nobody in her household had recently died. She had the stillness of a person trained to be grateful for cruelty, because cruelty had paid her bill. When Cesare called to her, she flinched only in the fingers. "Come, Nora," said Belluno. "Do not hide by the rail like an unpaid seamstress. Pour the first wine tonight. You have a hand that looks innocent, which is useful in a family." Nora approached with lowered eyes. Voss watched her cross the deck. Then he looked not at her face, but at the hem of her black dress. A crescent of grey dust marked the fabric near her left ankle. He bent slightly, as if admiring the water, and the ribbon moved once between his fingers. the first not a Dr. Matteo Loredan, who had known Voss for only 3 days, had already learned not to ask too soon. They had met at the Danieli, where Voss had been called from Lausanne by an insurance house concerned with Belluno's glass collection. Loredan, a Venetian physician with a ruined practice and excellent discretion, had been asked to accompany him because he knew the old families and their illnesses. He had expected a cold investigator. He had found instead a man of almost painful courtesy, who noticed stains, grief, lies, and incorrectly folded napkins with the same disciplined attention. The Santa Lucia pulled away from the quay. A boy on the embankment ran alongside for 20 paces, shouting something about a lost hat. A woman in an upper window shook a rug. Brown dust fell like tired confetti. The steamboat's whistle gave a hoarse cry. The empty birdcage swung once, twice, then settled with its little mirror facing the saloon stairs. Inside, the vessel had been restored with money and no mercy. The saloon walls were panelled in walnut so highly polished that every face appeared twice, once alive and once varnished. Red velvet benches ran beneath oval windows. On each table sat a glass fish made in Belluno's furnace, delicate and ugly, fins too sharp for touching. Voss examined the nearest fish. An animal made transparent, he said. A curious ambition. Belluno laughed too loudly. You are severe, Monsieur Voss. I was. The Swiss do not forgive decoration. We forgive it when it tells the truth about itself. Then you will forgive my glass. It tells the truth about wealth. Perhaps, said Voss. Wealth usually prefers mirrors. Belluno's eyes narrowed, then widened in performance. My dear guests, our investigator has teeth. Excellent. I adore the teeth of a guest, provided they do not bite the host. Marco lifted his glass. My uncle enjoys being bitten, said Signor Voss. He only complains when the wound fails to flatter him. The laughter that followed was careful, moved round the saloon like a servant carrying a tray through a narrow room. Nora did not laugh. Viola Rennie laughed late, to seeing that others had done so. Father Anselmo smiled at the tablecloth. At 10:30, Belluno announced that he would show Voss the private cabinet. It contains the object your employers worry about, he said. A little jewel of glass, a cup so thin that a man may cut his pride on it. I insure it for more than my nephew's character. Marco gave a lazy bow. My character is not fragile, uncle. It survives daily handling. Belluno ignored him. Cabinet lay behind a green curtain at the aft end of the saloon. Only Belluno had the key. He produced it from a chain, his theatrical slowness. The others watched, because Belluno required watching, because people who depend on rich men learn to admire doors before they open. Voss did not watch the key. He watched Nora. Her gaze had gone to the empty birdcage visible through the oval window. Her lips moved, shaping no prayer, Loredan recognized. Then she turned away so quickly that her earring struck the glass fish beside her plate and made it ring. Belluno drew the curtain aside. Behind it stood a narrow cabinet bolted to the wall. Inside, resting on black velvet, was a goblet of pale green glass, scarcely thicker than breath. It had a twisted stem, a shallow bowl, and a faint flaw near the rim like a frozen tear. My father called it the widow's cup, said Belluno. Vulgar name, but useful. People remember vulgarity. It was made for a bride whose husband died before the wedding. She drank from it alone, so the story goes. People adore sorrow when it has a price. Viola Rennie's hand moved to her throat again. That is a cruel thing to say, Cesare. Even for you it has edges. My dear Viola, sorrow fed your career for 20 years. We must not pretend you did not dine well on grief. She turned pale beneath her powder. Marco stepped forward, but she stopped him with 2 fingers on his sleeve. The gesture was small. Ownership was not. Voss saw it. He tied no new knot. The steamboat slid northward, passing under laundry lines, balconies, and windows where old women leaned out like carved figures from ships. By noon the lagoon opened wider. Murano lay ahead, low and brick-coloured, furnace chimneys standing against the pale sky. Belluno ordered wine. The servants moved below. The guests arranged themselves into little alliances of resentment. It was then that Voss said that everyone later remembered. Trouble with boats, he observed, is that people believe water erases footsteps. It does not. It merely teaches them to travel. Nora looked at him sharply. Captain Nani, from the doorway, gave the smallest frown. Belluno clapped his hands. Enough philosophy. We shall eat at 1. Until then, admire my city, envy my cup, and avoid confessing anything dull." He swept toward the stairs leading to his private cabin below. An hour later, the lunch bell rang. Cesare Belluno did not appear. Marco joked first. Then Beatrice Soranzo complained that soup cooled quickly on boats. Father Anselmo offered to fetch the host, but Captain Nani went instead. He descended the narrow stairs, with the heavy tread of a man unwilling to hurry in front of passengers. He returned without Belluno. His face had changed. "Doctor," he said to Loredan, "you had better come below. Monsieur Voss may come as well. The rest of you should remain seated, though I have never known people to obey when obedience might spare them." They found Cesare Belluno in his private cabin, seated at his writing desk, as though interrupted while composing an insult. His head rested against the chair back. His cigar lay unburned in the ash dish. One hand clutched the chain at his waist. The key was gone. On the desk stood the empty bird cage. Inside it, porcelain dish, rested a single green glass shard. Voss looked at the dead man, the cage, the missing key, and the oval window latched from within. Then he took the blue ribbon from his pocket and tied the second knot with great care. "My dear doctor," he said softly, "this murder has begun by pretending to be a theft. That is discourteous. It assumes we are vain enough to accept the first story offered." And from above came Nora Belluno's cry, sharp enough to make the little mirror in the birdcage tremble. Chapter 2, The Key That Preferred Water. Nora Belluno's cry did not sound like fear. Fear rises. It asks for witnesses. Nora's cry broke downward, as though some weight inside her had finally torn through the floor of her restraint. By the time Voss and Dr. Loredan reached the saloon, she was standing beside the green-curtained cabinet, one hand against the walnut wall, the other pressed flat to her mouth. The cabinet door hung open. The black velvet shelf was empty. Only the faint oval mark remained where the widow's cup had stood. Marco Belluno was the first to speak, because men who expect inheritance often mistake speed for authority. "This is absurd. My uncle had the key. We all saw him with it. The cup is gone. Then whoever killed him took it, and whoever took it is still aboard." Professor Soranzo gave a dry, little brilliant deduction, Signor Marco. "I see grief has sharpened you." Marco turned on him. "You will not make jokes over my uncle's body. He had many faults, but he was family, and one does not permit strangers to pick at family before the blood is cold." "Your uncle picked at everyone," said Beatrice Soranzo without looking from her glove. "It is perhaps natural that people learned from him." Voss stood at the cabinet. He did not touch the velvet. He bent close, his face reflected in the polished wood beside his real face, one calm and one darkened by varnish. "Captain Nani," he said. "Who left the saloon between the showing of the cup and the luncheon bell?" The captain rubbed one thumb across a scar on his knuckle. "Servants went below and came up again. I was at the wheelhouse. Signor Belluno went down alone. Signora Fabri stepped onto the after deck. The priest went forward. Professor complained. His stomach disliked the engine smell and walked about. That is what I saw, which is not the same as all that happened." Voss inclined his head. A useful distinction. Many witnesses ruin themselves by forgetting it. Eliana Fabri had seated herself near the window. Her veil had been lifted, showing a face composed with such care that sorrow could find no door in it. "Must we remain aboard with him below?" she asked. "I do not mean to sound delicate. I have outlived a husband, 2 lawsuits, and a winter in a palace with no heating. But a murdered host changes the flavour of luncheon." Father Anselmo looked at her with pained gentleness. "A man is dead, Signora. We might consider speaking of him before speaking of soup." "My dear father, I spoke of luncheon because death makes hypocrites hungry. You know that as well as I do." The priest lowered his eyes. His hands twisted once in his sleeves, then stilled. Voss noticed the twist. He also noticed that Viola Rennie had not moved since Nora's cry. The singer stood near the green curtain, not looking at the cabinet, not looking at Marco, not looking at anyone. Her gaze had fixed on the little glass fish at her table, where a chip now spoiled the sharp edge of one fin. "Madame Rennie," said Voss gently, "did you touch that ornament earlier?" She started. "Touched nothing. I mean, I may have brushed it when Nora came past. The table is narrow, and these foolish fish are placed as if one is meant to bleed before dessert." Her voice carried music, even in distress, but the notes were uneven. She spoke like someone afraid of hearing her own words. repeated by another person. Loredan examined the body below and returned with what he could say plainly. Belluno had died quickly. There was a bluish darkness about the lips, and a stiffness of the fingers that suggested poison, not violence. No wound showed. Struggle had disturbed the cabin. The writing desk held a blotter, 3 unopened letters, a silver cigar cutter, and the empty bird cage with a single shard. "No ordinary fainting, then?" asked Marco. "Your uncle did not faint into death," said Loredan. "Something was given to him, likely by mouth. The exact nature I cannot say aboard a steamboat, with lunch knives and smelling salts as my instruments." "By mouth," repeated Professor Soranzo. "Then we are to examine every glass and spoon like villagers in a melodrama." Voss turned from the cabinet. "We shall examine only what has behaved badly." "That is comforting," said Beatrice. "Most things behave badly around the Belluno family." Nora spoke for the first time. The cup must not be gone. Her voice was low, and the sentence was strange. Not cannot, not is not, must not, as if the disappearance offended some private bargain with the world. Marco softened at once. "Nora, sit down. You have had a shock, and my uncle was cruel to you this morning. Nobody will blame you for being overcome." She looked at him then, and Loredan saw something pass across her face that was not gratitude. It was a calculation wounded by pity. "I am not overcome, Marco. I am thinking." Voss gave her his full attention. "That is rarer than being overcome, Signor. Please continue." Nora swallowed. "When my uncle opened the cabinet, the cup was there. When he went below, the key was with him. If the murderer took the key after death, then came back here, opened the cabinet, and took the cup, someone should have seen them. The saloon was never empty." Professor Soranzo smiled thinly. "Unless the thief was among us and no one wished to note it. Society is built on that principle." Voss moved to the oval window nearest the cabinet. He unlatched it. The window opened outward only a little, checked by a brass chain, darkened with age. Through it came the smell of the lagoon, mud and salt and old rope. "Too small for a person," Marco said. "For a person, certainly. For a hand, perhaps. For an object, easily." Captain Nani stepped closer. "You think someone passed the cup through the window to a boat?" "I think the window wishes us to think so," said Voss. "That is different." He pointed to the lower sill. "There was a smear there, faint and grey, no wider, a thumb. It might have been dust. It might have been ash. It might have been nothing at all, except that Voss had already tied 2 knots in his ribbon, and Loredan was beginning to fear nothing at all in this man's presence. The captain leaned out and scanned the water. "No boat near enough. Not since we left the narrow canal." "Now no," said Voss. "Earlier, perhaps." Eliana laughed softly. "Monsieur Voss, Venice is made of boats. Accusing one of being near a window is like accusing a priest of owning black cloth." Father Anselmo looked up at that, wounded but silent. The search began under Voss's direction, though he gave orders as if offering favours. No passenger was to leave the saloon alone. Servant was to empty any dish, glass or ash. Captain Nani locked the lower cabin and took the key at Voss's request. Marco objected, then yielded when Vozod observed that inheritance did not confer police authority before the will had been read. They found the dead man's missing key 20 minutes later, not in a pocket, not beneath a bench, not hidden inside a glove, a napkin, one of the glass fish. It lay in the coal scuttle beside the small galley stove, blackened at the teeth, still attached to 2 broken links of Belluno's waist chain. The cook, a square woman named Teresa, crossed herself and began talking too quickly. "I never saw it, Signor. I swear by my mother's bones, and she had excellent bones. I stirred the coals for the soup, and there it was, shining like a devil's wink. Nobody comes into my gallery without my seeing, unless they are rich, because rich people enter rooms as if doors are apologized." "Who entered?" asked Voss. Teresa wiped both hands on her apron. They were already clean. Signor Marco asked whether the luncheon could be delayed. Professor Soranzo asked whether the fish was fresh, in a tone that made me want to serve him yesterday. Father Anselmo came for hot water. The young Signorina Nora stood at the passage, but she did not come in. She only asked whether my cage had been moved. "Your cage?" said Loredan. Teresa nodded toward the deck. "The bird. It was mine once, before Signor Belluno took it for decoration. My canary died in spring. Poor yellow saint. Signor Belluno said an empty cage was more poetic than a live bird, and put it aboard." Nora's face went white. Voss drew the pale blue ribbon from his pocket. He looked at the blackened key. The cook then through the saloon window toward the empty cage on the deck. He tied the third knot. "Signorina Belluno," he said very softly, "why did you ask whether the cage had been moved before you knew your uncle was dead?" Nora gripped the back of a chair. Marco stepped between them. "That is enough. She's frightened, and you are turning fright into guilt because it suits the neatness of your mind." Voss did not raise his voice. "My mind is not neat, signor. I merely keep it swept." Nora looked past Marco at Voss. "Because the cage was not on deck when we boarded," she said. "It was already in my uncle's cabin. I saw it through the open door before breakfast was served. Someone moved it to the deck, then back below after he died." No one spoke for several seconds. Then Captain Nani said what all of them had understood. "That means the cage was part of the murder before anyone thought there had been a murder." Voss untied none of his knots. "No, it means someone wished us to believe the cage was part of the murder. That is a more delicate vanity." Above them, the steamboat whistle sounded once, and from the locked cabin below came a faint metallic tap. Chapter 3. The woman who remembered too carefully. The metallic tap came again. It was not loud. It was the modest sound of a small object asking to be noted. Captain Nani went first down the passage, Voss behind him, and Loredan close enough to smell coal smoke in the captain's jacket. Marco followed, despite being told not to, which was entirely in keeping with his idea of grief. The private cabin was still locked. Captain Nani held up the key. Voss had given him. Jaw worked once before he put it in the lock. "No one passed me," he said. "The passage was watched. If there is a ghost aboard this boat, charge it." Voss looked at the door frame. A ghost would not leave that. Near the brass latch, caught in a splinter of varnish, was a dark thread. It was not from the captain's sleeve, nor from Voss's coat, nor from the dead man's jacket. Voss removed it with the tip of his glove and placed it on a folded visiting card. Inside the cabin, nothing appeared changed. Cesare Belluno sat where death had left him. The birdcage stood on the desk. The single green shard rested in its porcelain. The oval window remained latched. Then the tap sounded again. This time Loredan saw it. The little mirror inside the cage moved, not by hand, not by breath. It swung on its tiny hook, struck the gilt bar, and made that faint metallic note. Captain Nani crossed himself. Marco gave an angry laugh. "This is stagecraft. Someone has arranged a spring, a damned children's trick. My uncle loved humiliating people. Perhaps he planned this little theatre himself, before somebody improved the end." Voss bent to the cage. "You are right in one respect. It is theatre." He lifted the cage very slightly. From beneath it, half hidden by the desk blotter, trailed a fine wet line, ran toward the edge of the desk and disappeared over the side. "Doctor," said Voss, "do you see the floor beneath the desk?" Loredan knelt. There, almost invisible against the dark boards, lay a length of fine fishing line, wet and shining. One end was tied to the mirror, the other vanished through a narrow gap between two floor planks. Captain Nani muttered something ugly. "There is a maintenance crawl beneath this cabin. Pipes and steering rods. A boy could pass through, not a man." "Or a woman?" asked Marco quickly. Voss gave him a mild glance. "You offer suspects with an enthusiasm that does your grief no favours." Marco flushed. The line had been pulled from below, making the mirror tap against the cage. A signal, perhaps. Or a distraction. When the crawl space was open, they found only damp wood, grease, and a second length of line leading toward the galley. It ended near the coal scuttle, where the blackened key had been found. Teresa the cook received this news with outrage. "If someone has been crawling under my galley, hope they swallowed soot. A kitchen is a sacred place. Men think churches are sacred because they fear God. Kitchens are sacred because everyone fears hunger." Voss bowed to her. "Madame Teresa, I begin to understand this vessel better through your theology." She eyed him, uncertain whether she had been praised or arraigned. The guests were gathered again in the saloon. Their little circle had tightened. Death below, theft above. And now a secret line beneath the floor had made the Santa Lucia seem smaller than any gondola. Through the windows, Murano's furnaces showed brief orange mouths when doors opened and closed. The air smelled faintly of hot glass, river mud, soup, left too long near the stove. Voss stood beside the empty cabinet. "Someone aboard prepared a device," he said. The birdcage, the mirror, fishing line, the key in the coal. These were not accidents. They were invitations to think in one direction. Professor Soranzo folded his hands over his stomach. "You imply a mind fond of machinery." "Captain Nani understands the vessel." The cook knows the galley. The servants know the crawl space. We need not trouble educating people with ropes and holes. Beatrice looked at him with tired disgust. Dario, education has never stopped anyone from crawling when pride demanded it. Father Anselmo's lips moved as though he had almost smiled, and then remembered the body below. Voss turned to Viola Rennie. Madame, earlier you said you touched nothing, yet the glass fish at your table is chipped. When Signorina Nora passed you, your earring struck it. I observed that much, but the chip was not fresh then. It was already dull at the edge. Viola's hand went to her throat. You examine ornaments as if they were sinners, monsieur. I cannot account for every ugly fish in Cesare's floating museum. Of course not, but you can account for your memory. But you can remember too carefully. That is often less reliable than forgetting. Marco stepped toward her. Leave her alone. She had no reason to harm him. Eliana Fabri laughed from the window seat. My dear Marco, that is what people always say about women whose reasons they have not been invited to know. Viola turned on her. Psst. And you know so many women's reasons? You married a man older than your father, and buried him before the silver tarnished. Eliana's smile did not vanish, it hardened. I buried him after 23 years of listening to him chew. That is endurance, not crime. Quarrel might have become vulgar. But Voss lifted one gloved hand. Please, we have not yet earned vulgarity. He asked each guest to state, in order, where they had been during the hour after the cup was shown. Marco had remained mostly in the saloon, though he had gone to the galley. Viola had been at the piano for a while, trying the keys without singing. Eliana had gone onto the after deck to smoke. Father Anselmo had walked forward and later fetched hot water. Professor Soranzo had moved between the deck and the saloon, complaining of smell. Beatrice had written 2 postcards she had no intention of sending, because Venice made people expect correspondence. Nora had gone briefly to near the cabin. Why? Asked Voss. Nora looked at her hands. My uncle sent it to me. Marco stared at her. You never said that. You were busy defending me from questions I had not refused to answer. Her voice had sharpened. It made her seem older, perhaps simply less obedient. Voss waited. He wanted me to bring him the red ledger from the saloon drawer. He said the evening would be amusing if certain people saw certain numbers. He took it from me, and he was alive then. Time. A little before 12. Did he eat or drink? He had a glass on the desk. I do not know what was in it. He laughed when I looked at it and said, I should not worry, because a man like him never drank what other people poured. That sentence moved through the room like a knife passed hand to hand. Father Anselmo closed his eye. Beatrice Soranzo stopped worrying about the seam of her glove. Voss asked, Where is this red ledger now? Nora shook her head. It was not on the desk when we found him. Marco cursed softly. Professor Soranzo's expression became too blank. Eliana looked out of the window. Viola sat down. For the first time, the missing cup seemed less important than a missing book. Voss crossed to the saloon drawer Nora indicated. It was unlocked. Inside lay folded menus, 2 pencils, a packet of visiting cards, and a smear of red dust where a leather cover had rested for years. He touched the dust with one finger and examined it. Doctor, he said, you will forgive an observation that appears domestic. Red leather sheds differently when it is handled often by anxious fingers. Meaning? Asked Loredan. Meaning the ledger was not merely stored here, it was feared here. Captain Nani entered from the deck, carrying a damp scrap of paper caught on a mooring hook. The writing had blurred. 3 words remained legible. Paid. Silence. Murano. Nora read them and covered her face. Professor Soranzo said too quickly. Proves nothing. Venice floats on unpaid debts and silence. Murano merely supplies the scenery. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he touched the blue ribbon in his pocket, but did not tie another knot. Professor, he said, you are the first man today to explain evidence before being accused of. Soranzo's mouth opened, then closed. Outside, furnaces of Murano glowed brighter as the steamboat approached the quay. The city of glass waited with all its fires lit. And somewhere aboard the Santa Lucia, a red ledger had begun to matter more than a murdered man. Chapter 4. The Furnace That Refused to Forget. The Santa Lucia docked at Murano with a softness that felt deliberate, though even the boat understood that noise would be an insult. The ropes were thrown. The quay received them without ceremony. Across the water, furnace doors opened and closed, spilling orange light that looked almost human in its hunger. Captain Nani spoke quietly to the harbour man, turned back to Voss. "We are expected." Belluno arranged a private viewing at the Rossi furnace. "They are already waiting. If we cancel, questions begin elsewhere. If we go, questions remain here." "Then we shall go," said Voss. "People are most themselves when they believe the performance must continue." Marco protested at once. "My uncle is dead below. Cannot parade ourselves through a glass factory as though we were tourists with stomachs." Beatrice Soranzo adjusted her hat with precise fingers. "My dear Marco, you underestimate Venice. Death is the only thing here that never interrupts business. If your uncle had died in his shop, he would have been priced before he was mourned." Father Anselmo murmured something about propriety, then fell silent when he realized he had no authority to force it. Viola Rini wrapped her shawl tighter, though the day had not grown colder. Eliana Fabri rose with a small stretch, as if she had been waiting for movement to release her from the chair. Nora remained seated. Voss approached her. "You will come, Signorina," he said, not as a command but as a completed fact. She looked up at him. "You assume much." "I assume that what you saw in your uncle's cabin will make more sense in a place where glass is made to obey hands." Something flickered in her expression, recognition perhaps, or dread. She stood. Murano received them with the usual indifference reserved for visitors, who arrive believing they have come for beauty. The narrow streets smelled of heat and wet stone. Windows displayed delicate horrors, vases twisted like frozen smoke, animals that could not exist outside a flame, bowls so thin that light passed through them like a confession. At the Rossi furnace, a man with arms, the colour of baked clay, greeted. He wore no jacket despite the season. His shirt clung to him as though it had been painted on with sweat. "Signori," he said, "Signor Belluno promised us an audience that would appreciate difficulty. We have prepared something small." Marco made a tight gesture. "There will be no audience today. There has been an interruption." The man's eyes moved over the group. He saw the absence of Belluno without being told. "Ah," he said simply. "Then we shall make something that does not require applause." Voss watched the furnace. It breathed. There was no other word for it. The opening glowed, inhaled, exhaled. Worker turned a rod with slow patience, gathering a drop of molten glass that clung and lengthened, its colour somewhere between honey and fire. "Observe," said the furnace master. "Glass remembers the hand that shapes it, not in the way you imagine, not in marks or fingerprints. It is stressful in the way it cools. It will break later, when nobody is watching." He spoke not to entertain them, but because the act of explaining. Loredan noticed that his eyes returned often to Nora. If her presence complicated a memory he preferred to keep simple. Voss noticed it too. "Signor Rossi," he said, "have you known the Belluno family for a long time?" "All my life. My father worked for his father. I worked for him until I learned that selling to a man is different from belonging to him." "And yet you still accept his invitations." Rossi shrugged. "Venice is small. Pride is expensive." Marco shifted. "My uncle paid well. He demanded much. That is business." Rossi smiled without humour. "Your uncle paid for what he wanted to own. He demanded what he believed he already owned." The worker shaped the molten glass with a wooden block, the steam rising in sharp white bursts. The form changed under his hands. Obedient, stubborn, then obedient again. A cup began to appear, its rim thin as a promise. Viola Reni stepped closer. "It looks like the one he showed us," she said. "Nothing looks like that," said Rossi. "If you think it does, you have not looked long enough." Voss turned slightly. "Madame, you recognize the cup." She hesitated. "I recognize the story. Cesare told it often. The widow, the feast, the glass that cuts pride. He liked to repeat what made people uncomfortable." "And you were uncomfortable?" "I sang for him once," she said. "He told me afterward that sorrow is a commodity best sold young. He advised me to age into silence." Eliana laughed softly. "Practical advice. Brutal." "I did not," said Viola. "I discovered that silence has a price as well." Their exchange was interrupted by a shout from the back of the workshop. A young apprentice ran forward, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Maestro," he said, breathless. "This was delivered for Signor Belluno. They said it must be opened in front of him." Rossi frowned. "Who brought it?" "Boy." He did not wait. Marco stepped forward. "Give it to me." Voss lifted a hand. "Allow me." He took the cloth and unwrapped it with careful fingers. Inside, lay a small object of green glass. Not a cup, fragment shaped deliberately to resemble a piece broken from a rim. It was polished, its edges softened, but the curve was unmistakable. "Widow's cup," whispered Nora. "No," said Voss, a suggestion of it. Attached to the fragment was a thin strip of paper. The ink had bled slightly, but the words remained clear. "It breaks where it is weakest." Rossi made a low sound. "That is not a message for tourists." "Nor for glass," said Voss. Marco snatched the paper. "Someone is mocking us. This is theatre. They took the cup, they killed my uncle, and now they play games with fragments and riddles. Games require rules, Voss. We have not yet learned them." He turned to Nora. "Signorina, you saw the cup in your uncle's cabinet. Tell me, was there a flaw near the rim?" Her eyes closed briefly. "Yes, a small one, like a tear caught in the glass." Voss held the fragment to the light. "This curve does not match that flaw. It is close enough to deceive a careless glance, not close enough to satisfy a careful." Professor Soranzo had been silent until now. He stepped forward, peering at the fragment with an eagerness he attempted to disguise as irritation. "Copies," he said. "Imitation. Venice thrives on them. A man buys one cup and sells a dozen like it to those who cannot tell the difference." Rossi's gaze hardened. "We do not copy like that. Not here." "No," said Soranzo quickly. "Of course not here. I speak generally. Markets, not masters." Voss watched him. Then he looked at the furnace again, at the worker shaping the new cup, at the way the glass stretched and held, until a single moment when it would no longer do either. "Signor Rossi," he said, "when glass breaks later, as you say, does it always break at the same place?" Rossi wiped his hands on a cloth. "If the flaw is true, yes. If the flaw is false, if it was introduced to mislead, then it breaks where the hand that made it was weakest." "Thank you," said Voss. They returned to Santa Lucia, with the fragment wrapped again in cloth. The lagoon seemed wider now, the water flatter, as though it had decided to reflect nothing until asked properly. On deck, the empty birdcage had been moved. It no longer hung from the forward rail. It stood on the table beside the saloon window, its little mirror. Teresa the cook stood over it, arms folded. "I found it here when I came," she said. "I did not move it. I would not touch it now if you paid me with a church." Captain Nani swore under his breath. "No one passed me. No one left the group. This is nonsense." Voss did not look surprised. "It is not nonsense," he said. "It is insistence." He lifted the cage. The porcelain dish was empty. The green shard was gone. Nora stepped back. Marco's voice rose. "Enough. This cannot continue. Whoever is doing this must be found and stopped. We are not puppets to be arranged and rearranged like decorations in my uncle's ridiculous rooms." Voss set the cage down very gently. "On the contrary, signor, we are precisely that. The question is, who believes themselves to be the arranger?" He took the blue ribbon from his pocket. For a moment he did not tie it. Then, with a small, precise movement, he added the fourth knot. "And why?" he said quietly. "They need us to see the arrangement before it is complete." Chapter 5. The ledger that refused to stay missing. The Santa Lucia pulled away from Murano just as the furnaces reached their brightest hour. From the deck, the workshops looked like a row of open mouths, each breathing fire into the afternoon. The workers did not pause to watch the departing guests. Venice had taught them long ago that people who leave often believe they have taken something with them, when in fact they have merely carried a reflection. Inside the saloon, the arrangement of chairs had changed. Not dramatically, would have been too crude, but enough that anyone attentive would feel it without immediately knowing why. 2 chairs had been turned slightly toward the window. One had been moved a fraction closer to the cabinet. Table with the chipped glass. Fish now stood nearer the green curtain than before. Voss noticed all of this before he sat down. Then he noticed something else. "The room has been corrected," he said. Marco stared at it. "Corrected? My uncle is dead. His cup is gone. Someone is playing tricks with cages and mirrors. And you speak of furniture as though we were in a tailor's shop." "Exactly," said Voss. "Tailor's shop corrects the appearance of the body without altering its nature. Whoever arranged this room wishes to correct how we see it." Beatrice Soranzo gave a small nod. "That is uncomfortably accurate. I have known women who redecorate their salons whenever they are unhappy, though chairs could bear guilt better than people." Professor Soranzo ignored. "If you have a point, Monsieur Voss, you might consider offering it before supper." Some of us would prefer not to spend the evening as exhibits. Voss did not respond. He crossed to the saloon drawer again and opened it. The smear of red dust remained, but something new had appeared. A corner of leather, protruded just enough to be seen by someone who knew precisely where to look. Loredan felt a tightening in his chest. "That was not there before," said Voss. "It was not." He drew the object out slowly. The red ledger lay in his hands. It was not a large book, for its cover was worn smooth at the edges, the leather softened by years of being handled with care that bordered on anxiety. A thin ribbon marked a place near the middle. The pages within were filled with neat columns of names and numbers, written in a hand that was too controlled to be honest. Marco stepped forward. "That is my uncle's book. Give it to me." Voss held it lightly, as though it might decide to leave if gripped too tightly. "In a moment. First, let us admire its return." Eliana Fabry leaned back in her chair, her eyes bright with a kind of interest that had nothing to do with sympathy. "It returns like a guilty thought," she said, "not because it wishes to be known, but because it cannot remain hidden without effort." Father Anselmo crossed himself again, more quietly this time. "This is not a game. Whoever is doing this toys with souls." "On the contrary," said Voss, "they toy with perception. Souls are collateral." He opened the ledger. The first pages were ordinary enough: accounts, shipments, payments to workers, purchases of material. But as he turned the pages, the entries changed. Names appeared without explanation. Sums were listed without purpose. Beside some names, a single word had been written in Smorsel script: paid. Beside others, silent. And beside a few, Murano. Loredan felt the weight of the room shift. "This is not business," he said. "This is control." Marco's face had gone pale. "My uncle kept records of everything. He believed that knowing a man's debt was the same as owning him." "Your uncle was not entirely wrong," said Voss. He turned another page. There, written in the same careful hand, was a name that caused Nora to step back as though struck. Viola Rennie, beside it. Silence. Viola did not speak. She did not need to. Her stillness was louder than any denial. Marco looked at her. "What does that mean?" She shook her head. "It means nothing. It is one of his jokes. He enjoyed writing things that made people uncomfortable." "Did he pay you?" Marco pressed. "For singing," she said. "For performing at his dinners. Nothing more." Eliana's voice slipped in, smooth as oil. "And yet he wrote silence, not song. That is a curious distinction." Viola turned on her. "You will not invent meanings for me. Done enough of that for yourself." Eliana smiled faintly. "My dear, I never invent. I merely observe what others pretend not to see." Voss closed the ledger. "Let us not assign meanings prematurely. This book is a map, not the territory. It shows us where to look, not what we will find." Professor Soranzo leaned forward, his interest no longer disguised. "Then where do you suggest we look?" "At the places where the map contradicts itself," said Voss. He took the blue ribbon from his pocket and examined the 4 knots already tied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added a 5th. Loredan had begun to understand the ritual. Each knot marked not a discovery, but a contradiction, something that did not align with the story being told. And there were many stories now: the stolen cup, the poisoned host, the moving cage, turning ledger. Each one suggested a different crime. Together they suggested something else entirely. Captain Nani entered the saloon, his expression grim. "We have searched the vessel again. No hidden compartments, no stowaways. No sign of the cup or the shard. Whoever moves these things does so without being seen." "Or without being noticed," said Voss. The captain frowned. "You draw a fine line between those." "It is the only line worth drawing." Teresa, the cook, appeared behind him, wiping her hands. "I have checked the galley twice. No more keys, no more lines, no more surprises. If someone wishes to play with my kitchen again, they will find I am not as forgiving as a priest." Father Anselmo inclined his head. "I would not presume to compete." A faint smile touched Teresa's lips before she remembered the circumstances and wiped it away. Voss turned back to the ledger. "Signorina Nora," he said, "your name does not appear." She looked at him sharply. "That is not surprising. I have nothing he could record. Everyone has something," said Voss. "The absence of a record is often the most deliberate entry of all." Marco stepped closer to her. "You see, even now he implies." "I imply nothing," said Voss calmly. "I observe. Your cousin's absence from this ledger is a fact. Whether it is meaningful remains to be seen. Nora's gaze did not leave. You believe it is meaningful. I believe everything is meaningful to someone, he replied. The steamboat rocked gently as it left the shelter of Murano and entered the broader lagoon. The light had shifted. Afternoon was beginning its slow descent toward evening, and the reflections on the water had grown longer, less certain. Viola moved to the piano again. She did not play at first. She sat with her hands resting on the keys, though waiting for them to remember something she had forgotten. Then, very softly, she began. The melody was simple, too simple for a singer of her reputation. It repeated itself with small variations, each one slightly wrong, slightly off, as though the music were trying to return to a place it could not quite find. Voss listened. Then he spoke almost to himself, theme repeated with errors, a memory altered just enough to mislead. Yes, that is consistent. Loredan looked at him. With what? Everything, said Voss. He rose and crossed to the birdcage on the table. The little mirror inside it had been turned inward, reflecting nothing but the gilt bars. He reached in and touched it lightly. It swung once, and for a brief moment caught the light from the window. Loredan thought he saw something reflected there. Not the room, not the faces, but a flash of green, glass catching fire. Then it was gone. Voss withdrew his hand. Captain, he said, when we reach Venice, no one leaves this vessel until I have asked a final question. Marco laughed harshly. You speak as though you already know the answer. Voss looked at him with quiet politeness. I do, he said. The room seemed to contract around those words. Nora's breath caught. Viola's hands faltered on the keys. Professor Soranzo went very still. Eliana Fabri smiled, but there was no amusement in it now. Father Anselmo bowed his head. And somewhere below in the locked cabin where Cesare Belluno sat with his secrets, the little mirror in the bird cage gave one last, faint tap. Chapter 6. The meal no one finished. The soup arrived because habit is stronger than horror. Teresa set the bowls down with a firmness that bordered on defiance, as though feeding the living might hold death at a respectful distance. Steam rose in pale ribbons. The scent was honest. Onions softened in butter, a hint of fennel broth that had been given time rather than instruction. No one thanked her. She did not require it. Eat, she said. You will need your heads. Professor Soranzo lifted his spoon first, perhaps because he could not bear to be seen hesitating. Marco followed, then stopped halfway through the motion, as if the act of eating might acknowledge a world he was no longer certain existed. Viola did not touch her bowl. Eliana tasted, then set the spoon down, her expression carefully neutral. Father Anselmo murmured a blessing that trailed into silence when he realized he did not know whether to include the dead. Nora held her spoon but did not move it. Voss sat. He did not eat. He observed the bowls, the hand, the small betrayals of appetite and restraint. Then, very deliberately, he took a spoonful and tasted it. Excellent, he said. Madame Teresa, you have committed the rare act of making something simple without humiliating it. Teresa snorted, half pleased despite herself. I do not humiliate my ingredients. People do that well enough, without help. Voss inclined his head. Just so. He set the spoon down. Now we shall consider how a man might be given something he believes he has chosen not to accept. Marco exhaled sharply. You mean poison? Say it plainly. He was poisoned. Plainness is a form of accuracy, said Voss. But it is not always sufficient. Your uncle told Signorina Nora that he did not drink what others poured. That is a declaration of control. To poison such a man, one must not offer him a drink. One must allow him to believe he has not been offered anything at all. Professor Soranzo wiped his lips with unnecessary care. You propose that he poisoned himself out of vanity. I propose that his vanity was used as a door, said Voss. Unarranged for him to take the poison without recognizing the hand that placed it. Captain Nani leaned against the doorframe. There was a glass on his desk. The doctor saw it. If not poured, then what? Voss's gaze moved to the bowls of soup. Salt, he said. Teresa stiffened. My kitchen is clean. I have no doubt, said Voss. Salt is not owned by kitchens alone. He rose and crossed to the sideboard. A small dish of salt sat there, does in any room where food might appear. He touched it lightly, then brought his fingers to his lips. Ordinary, he said. And yet, one were to mix a small quantity of a certain substance with salt, it would pass unnoticed. A man might take it to his tongue without suspicion, particularly a man who prides himself on refusing what is offered to him. Father Anselmo looked up, troubled. You mean he tasted the salt himself? Without knowing. Men like Signor Belluno test the world constantly, said Voss. They touch, they sample, prove that nothing is beyond their reach. It is a habit. Habits are reliable. Loredan nodded slowly. The stiffness of the fingers. The colour. Yes, it would fit. A small amount taken directly. Marco's voice had gone quiet. Who would know that about him? Who would think of such a thing? Voss did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the piano. Viola's hands hovered above the melody she had begun earlier had dissolved into fragments, notes that refused to settle into a pattern. Madame, said Voss, your music repeats itself with small errors. You return to the same phrase, but each time you alter it slightly. Why? She looked at him as though he had struck her. I am out of practice. That is not the reason. Her lips trembled. It is because I cannot remember how it ended. The room held that sentence carefully, like something fragile that might cut if dropped. Voss nodded. Memory altered. Repetition with variation. A pattern disguised as disorder. He turned back to the table. The ledger, he said, returns when it wishes to be seen. The cage moves when it wishes to be noticed. The fragment appears where it will provoke recognition. Each element is repeated, but never in quite the same way. Someone aboard this vessel is not merely acting. They are composing. Eliana leaned forward. You speak as though we are inside a performance. We are, said Voss, but the audience has not yet been told what they are watching. Professor Soranzo laughed, a short, brittle sound. Psst. And you believe you will provide the programme? I believe the programme has already been printed, said Voss. We have simply not read it correctly. He returned to his seat. Let us consider the ledger again. Names, numbers, and 3 words repeated. Paid, silence, Murano. These are not accounts, they are categories. They divide people into functions. Marco frowned. My uncle kept records of debts. That is all. Debts of money are simple, said Voss. They are paid or unpaid. Debts of silence are more complex. They require maintenance. They require fear. Father Anselmo's hands tightened. You suggest he bought people's silence. I suggest he recorded it, said Voss. Whether he bought it, earned it, or forced it is a matter of detail. Nora spoke suddenly. He controlled them. All eyes turned to her. He knew things about people, she continued. Things they did not want to know. He would mention them casually, as though they were jokes. And then he would write something in that book. After that, they behaved differently. Her voice did not rise. It sharpened. Marco shook his head. You exaggerate. He was unpleasant, yes. But not what? Nora asked. Not powerful enough to make people afraid? You did not see him. There were no guests. You did not hear what he said when he did not need to impress anyone. Silence settled, but it was not empty. It held accusation, memory, and something like relief. Voss watched her. Then he took the blue ribbon from his pocket. 5 knots already marked it. He added a 6th. This is no longer a theft disguised as a murder, he said quietly. It is a system revealed by death. Captain Nani frowned. And the cup? The cup is a symbol, said Voss. It distracts, it draws attention. It allows the real matter to move beneath it, like a line under a floor. Teresa crossed her arms. I prefer distractions I can cook. Voss allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. Understandable. He turned to Marco. Signor, your uncle summoned Signorina Nora to bring him the ledger. He wished to show certain numbers to certain people. Suggests he intended a revelation, a public one. Marco's expression tightened. He enjoyed humiliating people. Indeed, said Voss, but humiliation is rarely random. It is directed. He intended to reveal something specific. The ledger would have provided the names. The cup would have provided the stage. Eliana's eyes gleamed. A toast, perhaps, a story, a demonstration. Yes, said Voss, and someone wished to prevent that demonstration. Not by hiding the ledger, it returned. Not by hiding the cup, it reappears in fragments. By altering the performance entirely. Viola's voice was barely audible. By killing him, by rewriting the ending, said Voss. The steamboat shifted again as it entered narrower. Venice lay ahead, her domes and towers rising like a memory that refused to fade. The light had softened. Evening approached with a kind of deliberate grace, as though it understood that what remained to be revealed required a different tone. Voss stood. When we dock, he said, we shall gather once more in this room. I will ask a final question, and then I will answer all the others. Marco rose as well. Said that before. Yes, said Voss. But now I mean it. He looked at each of them in turn. At Marco, confidence had begun to fracture. At Viola, whose memory refused to settle. At Eliana, whose amusement had become something sharper. Professor Soranzo, whose irritation masked a growing unease. At Father Anselmo, who seemed to carry a weight he had not yet named. At Nora, who stood very still, as though bracing for something she had always known would come. And then, quietly, Voss added, "The truth, I think, will not please anyone. That is how one recognizes it." No one spoke. No one finished their meal. And as the Santa Lucia slid toward Venice, the untouched bowls of soup cooled, their surface forming a thin, delicate skin, like glass, waiting for the smallest flaw to make it break. Chapter 7. The question no one wanted Venice received them without curiosity. The Santa Lucia eased back toward the Riva degli Schiavoni, where lanterns were already being lit one by one, as though the city preferred to reveal itself in fragments. The water had grown darker, reflections lengthened and distorted. A gondolier passed close enough that his oar brushed the steamboat's side with a soft, deliberate scrape, marking their return. No one aboard spoke as the ropes were thrown. Captain Nani gave orders in a voice that avoided authority. Teresa disappeared below without looking at anyone. The harbourman tied off the line and left as quickly as he had come. It was understood, without being declared, that no one would step ashore. Inside the saloon, the arrangement of chairs remained as it had been, corrected. Cabinets stood open. The ledger lay on the table. The empty birdcage faced inward, its small mirror now angled so that it reflected the doorway rather than the room. Voss entered last. He closed the door behind him. Click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. "Please sit," he said. No one asked why. They obeyed because they had reached the point where resistance felt like a performance too obvious to sustain. Marco took his place near Nora. She did not look at him. Viola sat at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap. Eliana leaned back in her chair, one arm draped across the back as though she were watching a play she had already decided to criticize. Professor Soranzo sat stiffly, his fingers interlocked too tightly. Beatrice beside him appeared calmer, but her stillness had the quality of someone who has chosen to stop interfering. Father Anselmo stood for a moment, then lowered himself into a chair with a quiet resignation. Voss remained standing. He did not begin at once. Instead, he walked to the birdcage and adjusted the mirror by a fraction. The reflection shifted. Now it caught a portion of the table, the ledger, and one stood in a certain place, the face of whoever sat nearest the cabinet. "Now," he said, "we shall ask a question." Marco exhaled. At last, Voss looked at, "Not the question you expect. The obvious question, who killed Signor Belluno, will answer itself when the correct question is asked." Professor Soranzo made a small impatient sound. "You enjoy your riddles, monsieur. Some of us prefer clarity." "Clarity," said Voss, "is the result of patience, not its substitute." He placed his hand lightly on the ledger. Book divides people into 3 categories: paid, silence, Murano. It suggests a system of control. It also suggests that the same person may move between categories depending on circumstance. Eliana tilted. "People do that all the time. We pay. We keep silent. We travel. You make it sound sinister." "I make it sound deliberate," said Voss. He opened the ledger to the marked page. "Here is Madame Rennie. Marked silence. We might ask, what silence? What was required of her? Or perhaps, what was withheld?" Viola's hands tightened in her lap. "I told you he paid me for performances." "Yes," said Voss, "and perhaps for something else. We shall return to that." He turned a page. "Here is Professor Soranzo, marked Murano. That is curious. You are a historian of trade, not a maker of glass. Why would your name be associated with Murano in this context?" Soranzo's mouth tightened. "I have consulted for the furnaces. Academic work, perfectly legitimate." "Of course," said Voss. "Legitimacy is often a matter of documentation." He closed the book, but the most interesting entry is the one that does not exist. He looked at Nora. "Signorina, your name is absent. That is unusual in a system designed to record influence. It suggests either that you had nothing to offer, or that what you offered could not be written." Nora met his gaze. "Or that he did not consider me worth recording." "Your uncle recorded what he feared losing," said Voss. "Absence is not indifference. It is a strategy." Marco stood abruptly. "This is intolerable. You circle around us like a man describing a painting he refuses to show. If you know something, say it plainly. Voss regarded him with calm interest. You are impatient, signor. That is natural. But impatience often reveals more than it conceals. He turned to the group. The question we must ask is not who killed Cesare Belluno. It is this. What was he about to reveal at supper that made his death necessary before the first course? The room shifted. It was not visible, but it was undeniable. The air changed. The weight of attention moved from the dead man to the living. Eliana's smile faded. Professor Soranzo's fingers loosened slightly, then tightened again. Viola's breath caught. Father Anselmo closed his eye. Nora did not move. Marco looked from one face to another, as though searching for a reaction he could use. Voss continued. He summoned Signorina Nora to bring the ledger. He intended to show it. He intended to expose something. Not privately, public, before witnesses. He stepped away from the table. The cup, the so-called widow's cup, was to be the instrument of that exposure. Toast, a story, a demonstration. The symbolism is obvious. A vessel associated with loss, used to deliver revelation. Beatrice spoke for the first time since docking, and someone chose to prevent that revelation by killing him. Yes, said Voss, but not only that, they chose to replace it with another. He gestured toward the birdcage, the cage, the mirror, the fragment, the moving objects. These are not random distraction, they are a new performance, one designed to lead us to a different conclusion. Captain Nani frowned. Which conclusion? That the cup was stolen, that the murder was a byproduct of theft, that we should look outward, to boats, to windows, to outsiders. And you believe that is false, said Eliana. I believe it is insufficient, said Voss. He took the blue ribbon from his pocket. 6 knots already marked it. He held it up for a moment, then added a 7th. The contradictions accumulate, he said softly. The cage moves before and after death. The ledger disappears and returns. The key travels from chain to coal. The fragment appears in Murano. Each element insists on being noticed. That is not the behaviour of someone trying to escape. It is the behaviour of someone trying to direct. Professor Soranzo's voice was quieter now. Direct us where? Voss looked at him. To a person who appears to have nothing to hide. The silence that followed was not empty, filled with the sound of people recognizing themselves in a possibility they had hoped to avoid. Marco laughed. But there was no humour in it. That could be any of us. Not quite. So he walked slowly around the room, his gaze moving from one face to another, not accusing, not selecting, but observing. When the cage was first seen, it was empty. That suggested absence. When it appeared in the cabin, it contained a shard. That suggested breakage. When it returned to the saloon, the shard was gone. That suggested removal. He stopped behind Nora's chair. Absence, breakage, removal, a sequence. Nora's hands gripped the edge of the table. Voss did not touch her. Signorina, he said gently, when you saw the cage in your uncle's cabin before breakfast, was it empty? She did not answer at once. Marco spoke instead. She has already told you. Voss raised a hand. I asked her. Nora's voice when it came was very quiet. No, she said, was not empty. Every head turned. What was inside? Asked Voss. She closed her eyes briefly. A piece of glass. The room seemed to tilt. Marco stared at her. You never said that. You never asked, she replied. Voss nodded once. Thank you. He moved away from her. Then the sequence is clearer. The shard existed before the murder. It was placed in the cage deliberately. It was not a result, a crime. It was a preparation. Captain Nani swore softly. So the breaking happened before he died. Yes, said Voss. Or rather, the idea of breaking looked at the ledger again. At supper, Signor Belluno intended to reveal something that would break someone, expose them, shatter their position. The cup was the symbol of that act. Eliana leaned forward, her voice low, and someone chose to break him instead. Precisely, said Voss. He paused. Then, very quietly, he added, the only remaining question is, stood to be broken by what he intended to reveal. No one spoke, because now the answer was no longer abstract. It was personal, and each of them, in their own way, began to understand that the truth Voss had promised would not merely identify a killer, it would expose a weakness, and in that exposure something else would break. Voss let the silence settle. Then he said, I will give you one more opportunity. If there is something you wish to say, something that would alter what follows, you may say it now. No one moved, no one spoke. Not even Nora. Voss inclined his head. Very well, he said. and for the first time there was something in his voice that resembled regret. Chapter 8. The Truth That Altered Its Shape. No one accepted the invitation to speak. It was not defiance, it was something quieter, more calculated. Each person in that room had lived long enough to understand that truth, once offered, rarely returns to its original owner. Better, perhaps, to let another man expose it, and then decide what portion to acknowledge. Voss did not press them. Instead, he walked once more to the birdcage. The mirror inside it still reflected the table and the ledger. Now, however, it also caught something else. Thin line of evening light entering through the oval window. It struck the gilt bars, broke into fragments, scattered across the polished wood like faint green fire. Voss adjusted the cage slightly. The reflection shifted again. Now it showed Nora. Only her face. Nothing else. He turned back to the others. The performance, he said, depends on where one chooses to stand. That is its entire power. Marco followed his gaze. What are you implying? Nothing yet, said Voss. I am arranging the scene. Professor Soranzo gave a strained laugh. You speak as though we are objects. We are behaving as such, said Voss. Objects moved, objects placed, objects observed. The difference between a person and an object is not always visible at first glance. He crossed to the table and opened the ledger again. This book records control. It records leverage, records the points at which a person may be made to act against their own interest. He tapped the page where Viola's name appeared. Silence. Debt that must be maintained. He turned another page. Murano. A connection to the furnaces, to the making of glass, to the manipulation of material that remembers the hand. He closed the book. And absence. The most interesting category of all. Nora did not move. Her stillness had changed. It was no longer passive. It had become deliberate. Voss saw it. So did Eliana. Ah, she said softly. There it is. Marco turned sharply. What do you mean? Eliana did not look at it. I mean that the most dangerous person in a room is not the one who speaks, but the one who waits. Nora's voice was calm. You mistake patience for danger. Eliana smiled. I rarely make mistakes. Voss raised a hand slightly. Please, we are very close to clarity. Let us not confuse it with cleverness. He walked slowly around the room again. When the cage first appeared, it contained a shard. That shard was not part of the cup. It was a suggestion, fragment designed to create a narrative. He stopped near Professor Soranzo. In Murano, we were given another fragment, similar, but not identical. Second suggestion. He moved to Viola. And here in the mirror, we saw a reflection of green light that did not correspond to any visible object. Third suggestion. He returned to the centre of the room. 3 fragments, 3 variations, none of them the original. All of them are convincing enough to guide perception. Captain Nani frowned. You mean the cup was never the point? I mean the cup was never present in the way we believed, said Voss. The words settled heavily. Marco shook his head. That is impossible. We saw it. He showed it to us. Yes, said Voss. He showed you something. He turned to Nora. Signorina, when you saw the cup in the cabinet, did you examine it closely? She hesitated. No. Did anyone? He asked, looking around the room. No one answered, because they had not. They had seen what they expected to see. A rare object, a valuable piece, a symbol of Belluno's wealth and taste. They had not questioned. Voss nodded. Then we must consider the possibility that the object in the cabinet was not what it appeared to be. Professor Soranzo leaned forward. Copy. A representation, said Voss. A version designed to be recognized without being verified. Eliana's eyes gleamed. You suggest that the famous cup may never have been aboard this vessel at all. I suggest that what was aboard was sufficient to create belief, said Voss. Marco's voice rose. Why would my uncle do that? He valued that cup more than anything he owned. Because he intended to use it, said Voss. Not as an object, but as a symbol, a prop in a performance. He needed it to be seen, not necessarily to be authentic. Viola spoke, her voice barely steady. And someone knew that. Yes, said Voss. He took the blue ribbon from his pocket. 7 knots marked it now. He held it for a moment, then added an 8th. The contradictions resolve, he said softly. The cup is not stolen. The fragments are not evidence. Cage is not a container. The ledger is not an account. Captain Nani exhaled slowly. Then what is left? Voss looked at Nora. Intention. The word seemed to draw the room inward. Nora met his gaze. And whose intention do you mean? Yours, said Voss. The silence that followed was absolute. Marco stared at her. No, that is absurd. She had no reason. Nora raised a hand. Let him finish. Voice was steady. Too steady. Voss inclined his head slightly. You were the only person who saw the cage in the cabin before the murder. You knew it contained a shard. You asked about its movement before anyone else understood its significance. You are absent from the ledger, which suggests you could not be controlled in the same way as the others. He paused. And you were summoned to bring the ledger to your uncle shortly before his death. Marco shook his head violently. That proves nothing. Proves opportunity at most. It proves position, said Voss. Opportunity is merely the shadow of position. Nora's hands rested lightly on the table. You accuse me of arranging all this? The cage, the fragments, the ledger, the poison. I do not accuse, said Voss. I observe. Eliana leaned forward, her voice low. And what do you observe, monsieur? Voss did not look at her. I observe a person who has lived in proximity to control long enough to understand its mechanism. A person who has been underestimated because she appears to have nothing to offer. A person who has learned to use absence as a form of presence. Nora's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. And you believe that person is me? I believe, said Voss, that you arranged the performance. Marco stepped forward. This is madness. Stop, Nora said. He did, because there was something in her voice that made stopping the only possible response. Remained. She looked at Voss. And if I did arrange it, what then? The question hung in the air, not as a denial, not as a confession, but as a shift. Voss studied her for a long moment. Then, he said quietly, we must determine whether you also committed the murder. Nora's lips curved slightly. And if I did not, then you are not the king, said Voss. But you remain central to the truth. Professor Soranzo let out a breath he had been holding. This is absurd. You turn suspicion into philosophy. We require facts. You require conclusions, said Voss. Facts are less accommodating. He turned away from Nora. Poison was delivered through habit. The arrangement of objects was designed to mislead. The ledger reveals a system of control. Fragments suggest manipulation of perception. He faced the room. All of these elements intersect at one point. He paused. Then he said, the moment before supper. No one spoke, because now the truth had taken shape, and it was no longer something. It had moved from possibility to inevitability. And in that movement, something within the room, within each of them, began to fracture, quietly, irreversibly, like glass remembering the hand made it. Chapter 9. Silence that was purchased. The room did not explode. It tightened, first thing Loddon understood. Truth did not arrive like a storm. It drew the air inward until breath itself felt like a decision. Nora remained seated, her hands still, her posture unchanged. Only her eyes moved, and even that movement was measured, though she had long ago learned the cost of reacting too quickly. Marco stood behind her chair. You will say something? He insisted. His voice lacked command now. You will deny this. You will explain, because this is grotesque. Nora did not look at him. What would you like me to explain, Marco? She asked quietly. The arrangement, or the expectation that I should have none, that you are not what he suggests. And what does he suggest? She said. Marco faltered, because Voss had not suggested anything in the ordinary sense. He had not named her a murderer. He had not described her actions as criminal. He had described her as central, and that was more dangerous. Voss let the moment extend. Then he spoke, not to Nora, but to the room. Signor Belluno controlled people through knowledge. The ledger confirms it. He recorded what others wished hidden. He converted private truths into public leverage. Father Anselmo bowed his head. That is a grave sin, to make a confession without forgiveness. Indeed, said Voss. And like all sins of control, it invites correction. Professor Soranzo shifted uneasily. You imply someone wished to destroy that control. I imply someone understood it completely, said Voss. He walked to the table and placed his hand on the ledger again. This book is not merely a record, it is a weapon. But like all weapons, it depends on the belief that it will be used. Eliana spoke softly. And if that belief is broken, then the weapon becomes useless, said Voss. He turned to Nora. You arranged the performance to break that belief. She did not deny it, but she did not confirm it either. Give me too much credit, she said. On the contrary, said Voss. I believe you have been given too little for a very long time. The sentence landed differently than the others. It did not accuse, It was recognized, and for the first time, something in Nora's expression shifted, not into fear, but into something more fragile. Marco saw it. "You knew," he said slowly. "You knew what he was doing. You knew about the ledger." Nora's gaze remained on Voss. "I lived in his house," she said. Knowing was not optional. Professor Soranzo leaned forward, his voice urgent now. "If she arranged this, if she staged these absurd movements, then she must have known he would die. She must have been involved." "Careful," said Voss. "You move too quickly from understanding to accusation. That is rarely accurate." Soranzo's hands tightened. "Then explain it. Explain how she arranges a performance around a murder she did not commit." Voss inclined his head slightly, with precision. He stepped away from the table and moved toward the centre of the room. Signor Belluno intended to reveal something at supper. The ledger would provide the names. The cup would provide the stage. The effect would be humiliation, perhaps ruin. Eliana's voice was almost a whisper. "And someone could not allow that." "Yes," said Voss, "but not everyone present had equal reason to fear exposure." He looked at Viola. "Madame Reni, your name appears under silence. That suggests your reputation depended on something remaining unspoken. Perhaps something from your past. Perhaps something more recent." Viola's hands trembled. "I have done nothing illegal." "I did not say it was illegal," said Voss. "I said unspoken." She swallowed. "I accepted money from patrons, not for what you imply, but for association, for presence, for being seen." Eliana gave a small, knowing smile. "We all do in one way or another." Voss nodded. "Your risk was reputational, significant but not fatal." He turned to Professor Soranzo. "Your name appears under Murano. That suggests a connection to the furnaces beyond academic interest. Perhaps financial, perhaps intellectual." Soranzo's voice sharpened. "I have advised on trade, that is all." "Of course," said Voss. "And if certain arrangements were revealed, position become uncomfortable, but not necessarily destroyed." Soranzo opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Voss turned to Eliana. "Signora Fabri, your name does not appear at all." She smiled. "I have always preferred to remain unrecorded." "Which suggests," said Voss, "that your arrangements are of a different nature, less dependent on documentation." She inclined her head. "You make it sound elegant." "It often is," said Voss. He turned finally to Nora. "And then there is you." The room seemed to lean. "You are absent from the ledger," Voss continued. "Not because you had nothing to offer, but because what you offered could not be recorded without diminishing its value." Marco's voice was strained. "What does that mean?" said Voss. "That Signor Belluno's control over you was not financial, not reputational, not professional." He paused. Then he said quietly, "It was personal." The word hung in the air. Nora's eyes did not leave him. "Go on," she said. Voss did not soften his tone. "He did not need to record his hold over you, because it was absolute. You lived under his authority. Future depended on his favour. Your choices were constrained by his will." Marco shook his head. "That is not. He was strict, yes, but—" Nora spoke over him. "He decided who I would marry," she said. "He decided where I would live. He decided what I would say in public, and what I would keep silent in private." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "And he intended to continue deciding," Voss said. "Yes," she replied. The simplicity of it made the room colder. Voss inclined his head. "And at supper, he intended to reveal something that would secure that control permanent." Nora's lips pressed together. "Yes." Marco stared at her. "What do you mean?" She did not look at him. "He intended to announce my engagement." The words fell without ceremony. "To whom?" Marco demanded. Nora's gaze flickered briefly, just briefly, toward Professor Soranzo. The movement was small, but it was enough. Beatrice Soranzo's head turned slowly toward her husband. Professor Soranzo went very still. "No," he said. But it was not a denial. It was a recognition. Eliana's smile returned, sharp now. "How?" "Efficient. A marriage that resolves multiple inconveniences at once." Marco's face had gone white. "You would have married him?" he asked Nora. She met his gaze at last. "I would have been made to." The room shifted again, because now the stakes were no longer abstract. They were human, immediate, irreversible. Voss spoke quietly, and that is what was to be revealed. Not merely a union, but a consolidation control. The ledger would ensure silence. Marriage would ensure permanence. He paused, and someone chose to prevent that. Professor Soranzo's voice was strained. I told him it was impossible. My wife, my position, he had no right." "He believed he had every right," said Voss. Soranzo's hands shook. "I would not have agreed." Nora's expression did not change. "You would have complied," she said. "Eventually. You always do." Beatrice rose slowly. "You told me this was business," she said to her husband. "You told me Murano was a business." Soranzo did not answer. Because he could not, Voss watched them. Then he spoke. "And now we understand why the performance was arranged. To disrupt the planned revelation. To shift attention away from the true conflict." He looked at Nora. "You arranged it, not to kill him, but to ensure that what he intended could not proceed as planned." She did not deny it. Marco exhaled slowly. "Then she is not the killer." Voss's gaze moved across the room. "No," he said quietly, "she is not." The relief that followed was immediate and premature, because Voss had not finished. And something in his expression made Loredan understand that the final truth would not restore balance, would remove it entirely. Voss took the blue ribbon from his pocket. 8 knots marked it. He held it for a moment, then he tied the 9th, and said, "But she is the reason the killer acted when they did." Chapter 10, The Hand That Chose the Moment. No one moved when Voss tied the 9th knot. The small motion of his fingers, precise, almost gentle, seemed to seal something in the room. Not the conclusion, not yet, but the direction from which it could no longer retreat. Marco spoke first, because silence had begun to feel like surrender. "She is not the killer," he said, his voice unsteady. "Then who is? And why? Why act then? Why act at all, if the marriage was not yet announced?" Voss folded the ribbon and placed it back into his pocket. "Because," he said, "the announcement was not dangerous. The ledger was. He let that settle. Signor Belluno intended to reveal the contents of this book publicly, not merely to announce a marriage, but to demonstrate the extent of his control, to show that silence, reputation, and obligation could all be recorded, arranged, and enforced." He looked at each of them. "That is a powerful gesture. It does not invite negotiation. It invites either submission or resistance." Professor Soranzo sat rigid, his face pale beneath the lamplight. "I told you," he said, almost pleading now. "I refuse, not have allowed it." "No," said Voss. "You would not have allowed it to be seen. That is a different matter." Soranzo's mouth opened, closed, because the distinction was too precise to escape. Voss continued. "You had the most to lose from the ledger's revelation, not because of the proposed marriage, though that would have been disastrous, but because your connection to Murano was not merely academic." Captain Nani shifted. "What connection?" Voss turned slightly. "Signor Rossi spoke of memory in glass, of how it breaks later when no one is watching. That is not a metaphor commonly used by merchants. It is the language of someone who has seen their work altered after it leaves their hands." He looked at Soranzo again. "You advised the furnaces?" "Yes. But you also arranged sale, quietly, through intermediaries. You introduced collectors to objects that were not always what they appeared to be." Eliana's voice was soft with interest. "Imitations, representations," said Voss. "Versions sufficient to satisfy belief, much like the cup aboard this vessel." Marco stared. "You mean—" "I mean," said Voss, "that the widow's cup shown this morning was not the original, was a carefully crafted substitute, one of several, and the knowledge of that substitutions existed in exactly 2 places, within the furnaces and within the ledger." The room tilted, not physically, but in certainty. Professor Soranzo's hands trembled now. "You cannot prove that." "I do not need to prove it," said Voss. "I need only observe that if Signor Belluno revealed this fact publicly, position would collapse. Your academic standing, your reputation, your marriage, all would be compromised." Beatrice did not look at her. "It is already true," she said quietly. Soranzo flinched. Voss did not soften. "You had a motive. You had an opportunity. You had knowledge of the vessel's structure, through your visits and your interest in its restoration. You knew of the crawl space beneath the cabin. You could arrange the line, the movement of the cage, the placement of the key." Captain Nani nodded slowly. "He asked me about the maintenance hatch last week. Said he was writing an article about historical vessels." Soranzo's voice rose. "That is not a crime." "No," said Voss, "but it is preparation." He stepped closer. The poison was administered through salt, not offered but taken. Small quantity placed where Belluno would test it himself. That required proximity, knowledge of habit, and timing. He paused. "Timing is where Signorina Nora becomes essential." All eyes turned to her again. Voss's voice remained calm. "Pause. She brought the ledger to Belluno shortly before noon. That was the moment the killer understood that the planned revelation would proceed, that the ledger would be opened, that their secret would be exposed. He looked at Soranzo. You acted then, not earlier, not later. Precise moment when delay was no longer possible. Soranzo shook his head. No, that is not. You went to the galley, Voss continued. You had a reason. You had already been there once. You could access the salt. You could introduce the poison. Then you returned to the saloon, where you were seen. Your movements were unremarkable because they were expected. Soranzo's breathing had become uneven. You have no evidence. I have behaviour, said Voss. And behaviour is more reliable than objects that can be moved. He gestured toward the cage. The rest, the line, mirror, the fragments, were part of the misdirection. A performance designed to suggest theft, to create a narrative that would occupy our attention while the truth remained beneath it. Eliana nodded slowly. A very elegant performance. Yes, said Voss, but one flaw remained. He turned fully towards Soranzo. You over-explained. The professor stared at him. What? You were the first to interpret evidence before it was understood. The fragment in Murano, you dismissed it as imitation immediately. The ledger, you reduced it to accounts. The cage, you treated as theatre. Voss's voice softened slightly. That is the behaviour of a man attempting to control the narrative. Not merely understand it. Silence fell. Not the earlier silence of tension, but a different one. A silence that recognises its own conclusion. Beatrice spoke. Dario, she said, is it true? He did not answer. He could not, because the question was no longer about proof. It was about recognition. Voss stepped back. Signor Soranzo, he said quietly, killed Cesare Belluno. Not in rage, not in panic, but in calculation. You chose the moment when his power was about to become irreversible. You chose the method that would leave no obvious trace. And you constructed a performance to conceal it. He paused. But you did not anticipate one thing. Soranzo's voice was barely audible. What? Voss looked at Nora. Someone else was also constructing once. The room seemed to hold its breath. Her arrangement did not cause the murder, Voss continued. But it altered its shape. It introduced variables you could not control. It forced you to act sooner than you might have wished. Disrupted your design. He looked back at Soranzo. And in that disruption you revealed yourself. Soranzo closed his eyes. For a moment, peered very old. When he opened them again, there was no denial left. Only exhaustion. He would have destroyed everything, he said. The words were not loud, but they carried on. He would have exposed me, yes. But not just me. Others. People who trusted him. People who believed their arrangements would remain private. He turned knowledge into ownership. He would have made it permanent. Voss did not argue. He believed he had that right, he said. And you did not? Asked Eliana. Soranzo looked at her. I believed it had to stop. Beatrice's voice was quiet. And so you killed him? Soranzo did not look at her. Yes. The admission did not break the room. It settled into it, like a flaw finally revealed in glass. Voss inclined his head slightly. Thank you. He did not raise his voice. He did not call for authorities. He simply said, Captain Nanny, we will require peace. The captain nodded and moved toward the door. No one stopped him, because there was nothing left to prevent, only consequences to accept. Voss stood still. His hands were folded. His expression is calm. There was something in his eyes now that had not been there before. Not satisfied, not triumph, something quieter. Something that understood exactly what had been broken and what had not. And that understanding carried its own weight. Chapter 11. The shape that remained. The police came as the light finished fading. They arrived without ceremony. 2 men in dark coats, one older, one young enough to mistake procedure for certain. Captain Nani met them at the gangway, spoke quietly, and led them below first. They did not linger in the cabin. Death had already told its story there. What remained was only the arrangement of the living. In the saloon, no one had moved far. Movement at that point would have felt theatrical. Professor Dario Soranzo stood where he had been left, one hand resting on the back of his chair, as though he required its support but refused to sit. Beatrice remained beside him, her posture straight, gaze no longer seeking. Marco had retreated to the window, staring out at the water, as if expecting it to answer a question he had not yet formed. Viola sat at the piano, her hands idle, her eyes fixed on the key. Eliana Fabri stood near the cabinet, reflection doubling her presence in the polished. Father Anselmo had resumed his quiet watchfulness. his hands folded, his lips moving without sound. And Nora had not moved at all. She sat where she had been, her hands resting lightly on the table beside the red ledger, her face composed not into calm, but into something more deliberate, acceptance without surrender. Voss stood near the birdcage. The little mirror inside it had been stilled. It no longer swung. It no longer tapped, reflected only the room, and in doing so it seemed almost harmless. Almost. The older officer entered first. He did not ask questions. He looked. That, Voss noted, was promising. The younger man followed, his attention sharper, quicker, less patient. Captain Nani gestured toward Soranzo. "This is the man," he said. The officer inclined his head. "We will speak in a moment," he said. "First, I would like to hear from the gentleman who has been conducting this inquiry." He looked at Voss. Voss inclined his head in return. "I will not detain you long," he said. "The essential facts are straightforward. Cesare Belluno was poisoned shortly before midday. The substance was introduced into salt, which he tasted of his own habit. The person responsible is Professor Dario Soranzo." The younger officer began to write immediately. The older one continued to watch. "And your certainty?" he asked. "Based on motive, opportunity, behaviour," said Voss. The professor had the most to lose from the revelation Belluno intended. He had access to the galley, knowledge of the vessel's structure, and a pattern of attempting to direct interpretation of events. The officer nodded once. "That will be sufficient for us to proceed." He turned to Soranzo. "You will come with us." Soranzo did not resist. He did not speak. He simply nodded, as though something within him had already completed the journey the officers now required him to make. Beatrice watched him. She did not follow. She did not reach for him. She remained where she was, her expression unchanged, as if the distance between them had been established long before this moment, and merely revealed now. The officers led Soranzo toward the door. As they passed Nora, he stopped. For a moment, it seemed he might speak to her. He did not. He moved on. The door closed behind them. The room exhaled, not in relief, in release. Something had been held in place, and now it had shifted. Not resolved, not repaired, simply altered. Marco turned from the window. "It is finished, then," he said. "No," said Voss. The word was quiet, but it carried. Marco frowned. "What do you mean?" "Killer has been taken. The truth has been arraigned," said Voss. "As it always is." He moved to the table and placed his hand on the ledger. "This remains." Nora looked at it. "Yes," she said. Eliana stepped closer. "What will be done with it?" Voss did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the ledger one last time. He turned the pages slowly. Names, numbers, words paid, silence, Murano. He closed the book. "The power of this object," he said, "lies not in what it contains, but in what people believe it contains. It is a record of control, but control requires belief." He looked at Nora. "You understand that?" She met his gaze. "Yes." Marco's voice was uncertain. "What are you saying?" Voss's expression did not change. "I am saying that the system Belluno created does not end with his death. It persists as long as the belief in it persists." Father Anselmo spoke softly. "Then it must be destroyed." Eliana smiled faintly. "Or repurposed." Viola looked up from the piano, or ignored. 3 responses, 3 possibilities. Voss considered them. Then he did something unexpected. He closed the ledger firmly and slid it across the table toward Nora. The movement was small, but it shifted everything. Marco stared. "What are you doing?" Voss did not look at him. "I am returning it to the person who understands it best." Nora did not touch the book immediately. She looked at it, then at Voss. "You trust me with this?" "I do not trust," he said. "I recognize." She studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she placed her hand on the ledger. The gesture was quiet, but it carried more weight than any accusation, any confession, any conclusion that had preceded it. Marco shook his head. "This is madness." "She arranged all of this. You said so yourself." "Yes," said Voss. "She arranged a performance to disrupt a greater one. And now you give her the means to control others." "I give her the means to choose," said Voss. The distinction settled. Nora opened the ledger. She turned a page, then another. Her expression did not change, but something in her posture did. Not power, not yet. Possibility. She closed the book. "What would you do?" she asked Voss. He considered the question. Then he said, "I would remove the belief that it is necessary." She nodded slowly. "That is more difficult than destroying it." "Yes," he said. "It is also more permanent." Silence followed, but it was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of something unresolved by design. Captain Nani returned briefly, confirming that the officers had departed with Saranza. Teresa emerged from below, wiping her hand, her expression unreadable. Beatrice remained near the wall, her gaze distant. Viola played a single note on the piano, then another, testing whether sound still behaved as expected. Eliana moved toward the door. "Well," she said lightly, "this has been a most instructive afternoon. I wonder what we shall all become after it." No one answered, because the question had no immediate form. Voss picked up the birdcage. He examined it for a moment. Then, with a small, deliberate motion, he unhooked the little mirror from its place and set it on the table. The cage without the mirror seemed diminished, simpler, almost honest. Placed it near the window. "An empty thing," he said softly, "is not always harmless, but it is at least clear about what it contains." Nora watched him. "And what does this contain?" she asked, touching the ledger. Voss met her gaze. "That depends," he said. "What you choose to see." He turned toward the door. As they stepped onto the deck, the evening had settled fully. Venice lay around them, her lights reflected in the water, each one trembling slightly, as though unsure of its own shape. Behind them, in the saloon, the red ledger rested beneath Nora's hand, unchanged and entirely different. Voss paused at the rail. He removed the blue ribbon from his pocket. 9 knots marked it. He studied them for a moment. Then, one by one, he untied them. The ribbon lay smooth again, though nothing had ever resisted it, as though every contradiction had been resolved, or perhaps simply released. Loredan looked at it. "And now?" he asked. Voss folded the ribbon carefully. "Now," he said, "we allow the consequences to choose their own shape." Slipped it back into his pocket. The water moved beneath them. The lights trembled, and somewhere in a room behind them, a decision had begun, quiet, precise, and impossible to undo.